This is my personal reflection as to why I support RFK Jr. I've been studying epigenetics as a clinical social worker for the last 4 years, driven to learn as much as I possibly can because I have a child with chronic health issues. The last 17 years of my life have defined my identity as a social worker. I have fought against some of the biggest corporations, governments, insurance companies, and systems that have perpetuated policies and practices that are the antithesis to justice. I've been bullied, attacked, smeared, and persecuted in ways that are inhumane and extremely socially isolating. As I shared in a previous post, the research on fitting in versus belonging was crucial in my development as a young social worker. Brene Brown, social worker, social scientist, has done an incredible job narrating these research terms and themes in a way that is relatable to everyone, regardless of profession. For the majority of my young life, I viewed fitting in as crucial to my sense of belonging, desperately associating my acceptance into a group as a mechanism to enhance my self-worth. It was my personal journey of becoming a social worker that eventually led me to a position in life where I feel a deep belonging to myself. My intrinsic worth can no longer be defined by external forces. It is truly the definition of liberation. I remember my very first job as a young social worker feeling extremely pressured to falsify documents. When you are a welfare worker, your participation rates are extremely important and tied to funding. Methods to exempt participants who are not meeting their requirements became increasingly important. I refused to backdate documents. I was punished and retaliated against. I was told by my supervisors that my attitude needed to be, quote-unquote, more flexible. Leaders were asking me if I was really in support of the agency's mission, questioning my core social work values. I actually had the highest participation rate out of all of the counselors at my office, and they were still pressuring me to boost my numbers. I spent months collecting documents and proof of wrongdoing and became a whistleblower. I was treated horribly by leaders of that nonprofit. They lost their contract soon after. In one of my first roles as a hospital social worker, I had a patient who was actively dying and their doctor refused to put them on hospice, even though their surrogate decision makers wanted this. I literally blocked the door when they were ready to bring this patient down for a spinal tap, an extremely painful procedure. I was yelled at, humiliated, and talked down to by every medical staff person in that room that day. I vividly remember the anger in one of our leaders' faces, saying that I had, quote-unquote, greatly interfered with patient care. 6 months later, I was recognized by the health system and given an award for my advocacy that day. In the later years of my career, I had to bring department leaders to my clinical rounds because the staff constantly harassed me and accused me of, quote-unquote, not caring about children. Oftentimes, social workers become the recipient of everyone's moral distress when complex situations arise involving abuse of a child. If the child returns to the family where the abuse occurred post-discharge, the social worker is often blamed. As one surgeon accused me, "You must not have properly explained this child's situation, or he never would have been returned." I have been accused of not caring about children, not supporting the clinical team to help children, etc. In reality, I do not support holding children in the hospital longer than they medically need to be there. The medical team is not the judge and jury if a child can be returned to their family. Over the years, on a daily basis, I was engaged in multiple initiatives, oftentimes completely on my own. I wrote letters to insurance companies who acted against the law in the provision of services, benefits, and appeal notices. Every day offered some insurmountable struggle, sometimes in ways that constituted life or death situations. It was incredibly stressful. In the final years of working in critical care medicine, I tackled one of my greatest hurdles yet, advocating for families to see their loved ones in ICUs during the COVID pandemic. We had strict visiting rules that only allowed visitors in ICU if someone was at an imminent risk of death. I was told one of the core reasons we couldn't allow visitors was because we didn't have the proper PPE available. Through some connections, I was able to get hundreds of N95 masks donated, but of course, that didn't change the visiting policy. I fought for families to be able to see their loved ones in ICU, understanding that this was literally the most important thing that we should have tried to continue to facilitate. Again, I was shamed and belittled for going against the popular opinion that ICUs should essentially be on lockdown. Also during this time, I stood up to organ donation companies. Well, it was one company, to be fair. They consistently used their power and influence to manipulate decision makers into donating their loved ones' organs. I remember vomiting in the bathroom after my first personal experience with this, understanding that the vulnerable family I had been working with had been pressured to donate their loved ones' organs. This was one of the most heartbreaking and gut-wrenching experiences of my life. I could not believe such evil existed in the world, and somehow I couldn't prevent it. In this case, there were religious and cultural reasons why the family did not wish to donate, and they were completely pressured into it, of course, during a meeting I wasn't invited to. No one should ever be pressured into organ donation under any circumstance. Oftentimes, in the busyness of a critical care environment, this happens frequently, when the company is left completely alone with vulnerable patients. This company has a history of underperforming and did not meet their quota goals. So of course, this translates into employing tactics to do whatever they can to secure the prize. In this case, human organs. In the aftermath, I was portrayed as someone who was against organ donation. They put up barriers for me to join the organ donation committee. They did everything they could to smear my name and discredit me. More recently, I found myself as the main community organizer to protect a wetland in my own backyard, threatened by development. The city had no community engagement, was willing to apply different standards and rules to this developer, refused to comply with city ordinances that would not have allowed this development, and refused to listen to neighborhood concerns. After a year, I grew a coalition of neighbors, environmentalists, bird experts, environmental attorneys, directors of nonprofits together. My highest trending post on Nextdoor accumulated nearly 30,000 views and was a top 10 trending post in the Twin Cities. Again, I was bullied, harassed, called out by the mayor and the city council members during session. One city council member told the crowd and the recorded audience via video feed that I was the reason her children were being bullied at school. The highest members of the government told me to stop posting on Nextdoor. I was bullied so severely during a community listening session, I found myself in tears. Toward the end of the saga, my email was hacked and my wetland communications vanished. Last winter, I attended a European Christmas market at Union Depot in St. Paul. We were having an incredibly wonderful time and stopped to listen to a choir that was performing on the main stage. I immediately noticed language that made me feel very uncomfortable in the carols and realized I was witnessing a brazen act of anti-Semitism. I looked around and no one seemed to care. Hundreds of people walking around and no one bothered to become concerned. I flagged down security guards who assured me the carolers were supposed to be there and had done nothing wrong. I immediately called the police and requested their assistance. It was discovered that the carolers lied to the event staff and told them that they were scheduled to perform when they actually had never been approved. It took me 2 days to track down the top people and discuss the situation at the venue. They were extremely apologetic and assured me there were, quote unquote, they were enhancing their protocols. She thanked me for reporting it and said no one else had called. Hot tears streamed down my face. I have hundreds of stories like this as a social worker, but these are in the forefront of my mind. This is not an attempt at virtue signaling. Believe me, there were times I could have done a lot more for injustice, but I was too tired from other continuous battles and didn't have the energy. In order to share what I am about to share, you must know this personal history about me. As Brené Brown describes, you must see me as a person. Unfortunately, I have deeply been impacted by propaganda and hurtful lies attacking my character because of my fight for justice. Perhaps that is why it is easier for me to recognize this persecution when others experience it. Fast forward to the present, and I find myself reminiscing about a recent trip to Guatemala. I visited a massive healing herb garden that the mission uses to treat and prevent illnesses. The winding paths and incredible foliage were a sudden proof of the sacredness of this indigenous way of life. The director explained that there were hundreds of herbs and carefully picked a leaf, smelled it, and ate it, saying in Spanish, "This one is good for your heart." I asked her if they used pesticides, and she was unfamiliar with the term. After explaining it in Spanish, she shook her head, looking rather disgusted, replying, "Using chemicals would not be respectful to the land or people." The Kaqchikel people have a spiritual connection with their medicine, food, and farming practices. We have a child with chronic illnesses. One day he was eating anything we put in front of him, seemingly developing into a quote-unquote normal child. Overnight he changed. He only ate 5 foods for several years. His speech regressed significantly, and he barely spoke until after the age of 3.5. Our child's illnesses were so debilitating to him and our family that I was unable to work. We had extreme anxiety about bringing him anywhere. Life was extremely challenging and stressful. People meant well by reassuring us this is all normal and he'll grow out of it. His doctors continued to recommend that we participate in therapy so that I could learn quote-unquote effective parenting strategies. This further pushed us into a secret realm, fearful of judgment and protective of our family. Clearly, whatever they thought was going on with our son was psychologically based, and we were made to feel completely inferior. I devoted a year of my life to studying his illnesses, treatments, and interventions. After several months seeing a functional integrative medicine doctor, our child began to thrive. After an extensive analysis of his urine and blood, we figured out physiological problems that needed immediate intervention. He was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, not previously diagnosed by any of his several specialists. In addition to several supplements, we addressed environmental toxins that were incredibly high and pervasive in his labs. As soon as we detoxed him and flooded his body with what he needed, he drastically improved. Our life is completely different. I also went through this assessment process and discovered incredible things about my body's functioning and needs. I've lost 15 pounds and I feel the healthiest I have in a long time. We discarded toxic items in our home that we had no idea were so incredibly harmful to our health. We only eat organic, nutrient-dense, and unprocessed foods now. We have a water filtration system that can now assure us that we are not getting any harmful chemicals through our water supply. This entire process was expensive and unfortunately out of reach for most people. I took my child to the ENT because one of his providers thought he could have enlarged adenoids. The ENT said I would need an X-ray to know for sure. In the meantime, she encouraged me to put my child on 2 different medications, including a steroid. He had just successfully weaned off of an anti-seizure medicine that took a lot of advocacy on my part to get him off of, so understandably, I was hesitant to start some kind of new drug. I asked how long he could be on it, and she casually said, "No end date." I started asking questions like, why should I start giving my son a steroid before I know, in fact, that he has enlarged adenoids? I thought that was a reasonable question. I was treated horribly and basically told it was up to me if I wanted to, quote unquote, go against medical advice. Okay. We met with a neurologist to go over my child's EEG, which is an incredibly stressful and difficult process to go through with a young child. We were told the test didn't really measure anything because he actually should have been sleeping for them to see any significant results. And yet no one told us during the EEG process that we should try to get our son to sleep. They were pretty quick, though, to send us a bill for over $2,000 for a lengthy and emotionally draining test that apparently showed nothing. Our primary doctor has belittled me for asking questions about vaccines. Why should I not be allowed to ask questions? These are the same providers who are quick to tell me that functional integrative medicine is, quote unquote, not real medicine. Looking at my son's lab paperwork from his functional medicine clinic, they didn't understand how to interpret the lab results for environmental toxins, therefore concluding it was nothing they'd ever seen before, so it must not be valid or accurate. I was never given any medical advice on supplements, probiotic strains, or any medical interventions to help autism symptoms during my several years taking my son to traditional doctors and specialists. I can easily recognize the existence of a smear campaign because it has been perpetuated on me more times than I would care to admit. This is where you need to see me as a person. I am appalled and shocked at the propaganda and negative media attention that RFK Jr. is enduring. This is a man who spent his entire career standing up to corrupt corporations, advocating for the voices of those often left behind. As an environmental attorney and health advocate, he took on the biggest cases that no one would touch out of fear of retaliation and harassment. Big food, AG, and pharmaceutical companies have an incredible amount of power in this country. Their corruption and influence is far-reaching and difficult to organize against. I admire anyone who has gone through the lengths this man has to dismantle these systems that are greatly contributing to the chronic health crisis of our fellow Americans. Please do not be a victim to mainstream media propaganda. Once cigarette companies began dying out due to much-needed government regulation, their scientists hopped over to the food world, spending decades modifying our foods to become more addictive, processed, and detrimental to our health. Our diets no longer consist of nutrient-dense whole foods. Pesticide-filled, engineered processed foods are accepted and promoted by our government. Remember, our government drilled us into the importance of the food pyramid, which we now know is driven by big food companies' interests and lobbying, not by actual health needs. It was only recently, actually, that the FDA came out and finally acknowledged that eggs are healthy, putting them on their approved quote-unquote healthy foods list. Eggs are literally nature's multivitamin and have been since the beginning of time. For years, we were told eggs were not healthy. Instead, Cheerios were recommended for breakfast. Even if you have diabetes, go ahead and enjoy. General Mills was a big sponsor to the American Diabetes Association, so naturally, their unhealthy processed food became a champion for diabetics everywhere. Dangerous chemicals are causing acute and chronic health issues. Items we typically have in our home can contain toxins such as endocrine disruptors. Laundry detergent, candles, plastic food storage containers, multi-purpose cleaners, air freshener, shampoo, conditioner, body wash, deodorant, etc. Pesticides are literally sprayed on everything these days, forcing Americans to buy organic items that are often double in cost. Chronic gut inflammation and more serious illnesses can develop as a result. Many food ingredients from American companies are banned in European countries, so they make different versions of the same product. For example, Kellogg's contains dyes and harmful additives in Fruit Loops sold in America, but they remove these chemicals for the cereals sold in Europe. Oh, but don't worry, CNN just recently reassured me that there is no scientific evidence that these dyes are harmful to children. Thank goodness. Fruit Loops seem like a great way for my kids to start the morning. What do you think? Last year, the most comprehensive ban globally on PFAS, Amara's Law, was passed in the state of Minnesota. Amara herself courageously addressed lawmakers and key stakeholders during the last months of her life to advocate for this legislation. 3M previously dumped chemicals that leaked into groundwater, causing a variety of health challenges for local residents. These forever chemicals were asserted as being completely fine for health. Even last year, an army of national lobbyists flew to Minnesota to try to convince lawmakers to not support this important legislation. These lobbyists even wrote articles in our own newspapers asserting the safe nature of PFAS and arguing that they should not be regulated. The legislation had bipartisan support, and Amara passed away shortly before it was passed. I have this image in my mind of Amara standing at the podium, courageously addressing the chamber. Even the best lobbyists were unable to prevent justice from being served that day. SF 188 is a bill currently in our legislature. If passed, it would require food manufacturers to test phthalate levels and submit these results to the Department of Agriculture, as well as posting them online. These chemicals are used to make plastics more durable. There is evidence that they are linked to birth defects, infertility, neurodevelopmental issues, etc. This would be a huge victory for health policy in our state, but get ready for the arrival of the National Lobbyist Squad. Their chorus will sing in unison that the chemicals are fine. There's no meaningful research to demonstrate otherwise, right? This is what RFK Jr. has outlined as being his health priorities. Banning harmful pesticides. They are literally everywhere, causing huge health problems. Do you feel good about eating a bowl of oatmeal knowing those grains contain pesticides? In studies with mice exposed to pesticides, the mice experience neurological impairments, reproductive issues, behavioral issues, to name a few. Some even died as a result of exposure. Standing up to big pharma. Pharmaceutical companies have way too much power and influence and are dictating our health priorities in this country. Medical schools are also being funded by them. Think critically about the implications of this conflict of interest. Making our drinking water safer. I encourage you to get a water filtration system, either reverse osmosis or vapor distilled water, if you don't already have one. Encouraging natural holistic health. People find healing in acupuncture, nutraceuticals, and other holistic ways that are not covered by insurance. Even seeing a functional medicine provider to test the toxins in your body isn't covered by insurance. RFK Jr. advocates to have natural options to treat and prevent illness. Informed consent. Most social workers are big on informed consent, right? I guess just not when CNN tells them it's a bad thing. Regenerative, sustainable farming and agriculture practices. Literally the healthiest way to grow and harvest food that respects the person and the environment. Better regulating food labels so you actually know what you're eating. Companies are notorious for hiding awful ingredients in their foods. Anyone remember the Subway bread fiasco? Their bread contained, I may not be pronouncing this correctly, azotic carbonamide, which they called a quote-unquote dough conditioner. The ingredient is also used to make yoga mats and shoe rubber. Yummy. Only thanks to the Food Babe, a popular food advocate, did Subway finally commit to eliminating this chemical several years ago. Gold standard for vaccine testing. This is a big one. The vaccine schedule for young children has exploded over the years. Parents are right to ask questions and do their own research and certainly should not be shamed for expressing vaccination concerns. Under the PrEP Act, companies like Pfizer and Moderna have total immunity from liability if someone experiences a vaccine injury. Just this one fact alone should have alarm bells of concern sounding. Standing up to big food companies. Top executives from the big food companies and big pharma cycle in and out of top government positions too. Their lobbying power is strong. They have shown their priorities lie in profits, not in the health and safety of their consumers eating their foods. The chemicals they use in many instances have safer alternatives that should be utilized and mandated. And finally, curing the chronic disease epidemic that is crippling our nation, especially our children. Childhood cancers, diabetes, obesity, neurodevelopment disorders, etc. have skyrocketed in ways that cannot be explained by genetic factors or simply stating that they are more easily detected these days. Something is going on in our environment, folks. I hope after listening to me that you still see me as a person. As Aldous Huxley, an English writer and philosopher, asserted, the purpose of propaganda is to make one set of people forget that the other set of people are human. If your Facebook, Instagram feed did not show you any content from the confirmation hearing where RFK Jr. talked about these health priorities, I implore you to critically think about why that is and what other information you might be missing that may help provide a more accurate picture. The United States of America should have the cleanest and most nutrient-dense food, provide access to the best healthcare options to treat and prevent chronic illness, and ensure gold standard metrics to evaluate any pharmaceuticals. RFK Jr.'s life mission and entire career has been dedicated to these values. As he highlighted during the confirmation hearing, quote unquote, there is no such thing as Republican children or Democratic children. These are our kids. It's time to stop protecting the interests of pharmaceutical companies who profit when Americans are not cured from chronic illness and disease, but become sicker. It's time to end the free pass given to the food industry who has spent decades manipulating our food for their own profit. Perhaps you might call me a conspiracy theorist. Perhaps you will no longer wish to maintain a friendship with me. You might stop inviting me to social functions because I no longer fit into a category that you deem worthy. As Brené Brown describes, True belonging never asks us to change who we are. It demands that we be who we are. I know one thing for certain. I have been through some of the most socially isolating smear campaigns I could possibly imagine as a social worker, designed to destroy and humiliate me, all because I threatened the status quo. Remember, I apparently don't support organ donation. I don't support keeping children safe. I refused to participate in fraud, and suddenly I was not flexible enough and had my dedication to my profession questioned. I chose to stand up for truth.
Hey, Louisa.
The narratives that people use to describe me and spent great lengths trying to get other people
There's
to
Anna.
believe were utterly false.
There's Dan.
Please remember, the person fighting against special interests, big lobbyists, and corruption is usually on the side of justice. RFK Jr. has been painted as a power-hungry, egocentric, conspiracy theorist maniac. Ask yourself, who benefits from this narrative? Why is mainstream media complicit? How do they prosper because of this? RFK Jr. has put himself and his family in a spotlight he didn't even want because he believes so greatly in the ideal of American health and safety. And to that, I say, I too am still here. In the name of justice, I'm still here.